A festival of light ended in darkness and theft. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me your city. I value your voices. Wolfe follows the glow. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle I had no intention of finishing when the bell rang. Not the front door bell, that's for the public, but the one Fritz keeps for emergencies. Since Fritz Brenner defines an emergency as anything that threatens the kitchen or Mr. Wolfe's peace, I set down my cup and got to the door fast enough to make sure it wasn't one of the latter. Fritz stood there looking as though someone had insulted a source. "Archie," he said gravely, "a lady insists on seeing Mr. Wolfe. She says it is urgent. Very urgent." I sighed. That was the word that usually meant I wouldn't get lunch at a reasonable hour. Did she mention which kind of urgency? Financial, moral, or hysterical? He gave me a reproachful look. She would not say, but she carried something, wrapped in cloth. She would not leave it with me. Now, that was new. People bring all sorts of things to the brownstone, letters, ledgers, once even a cat. But they don't usually clutch them like relics. I told Fritz to bring her to the office and went to warn the great man. Wolfe was, of course, in his chair. A book lay open on his lap. On the origin of the culinary instinct by some French eccentric who thought the human soul resided in the stomach. I figured Wolfe approved. He looked up when I entered, not because he wanted to, but because I didn't leave him a choice. "Archie," he said, "you are scowling. That is either indigestion or impending inconvenience." "Both," I said. "A woman downstairs with a package claims it's urgent." He grunted, a sound that meant reject and less vital. "She wouldn't leave it, and Fritz looks like he's about to resign in protest." Wolfe shut the book with a deliberate thunk. "Confound it. Very well. 10 minutes. That was as close to enthusiasm as he ever got before noon. The woman was tall, mid-30s, dressed in a way that said she had money but didn't trust it to behave. Her gloves were neat, her voice steady, but her eyes flicked around like she was expecting someone to barge in after her. She held a cloth-wrapped bundle in both hands. "Mr. Wolfe," she said when I'd shown her in. "My name is Eleanor Fane. I work for the Metropolitan Museum of Decorative Arts." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "My sympathies." She blinked, unsure whether that was an insult. With Wolfe, it usually was. "I'm here because," she went on, "something has been stolen from the museum. Something I was responsible for guarding. Madam, I'm not a constabulary adjunct. Report your loss to the police." "I can't," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but the fingers tightened around the cloth. "Because it was stolen from me. Not the museum vault." That got my attention. Wolfe's too, though he didn't show it. "Describe it," he said. She unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a small bronze lantern. Antique, delicate, the kind of thing you'd expect to see lighting Caesar's picnic table. But one side was shattered, the filigree bent in. "It's called the Lantern of Harmodius," she said. "Greek, 5th century BC. It disappeared from a private collection 2 weeks ago. Yesterday morning I found this on my doorstep." "Broken," I said. "Yes, and with a note that said, 'You'll need Wolfe.'" I glanced at him. For once he looked mildly put out, like someone had just sprinkled parsley on his steak. Wolfe spoke after a long pause. "You are certain no one but you had access to your residence?" She hesitated. "Not entirely. My fiancé, Julian Creel, has keys. He collects antiquities." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "A collector and a curator. An interesting partnership. Mr. Goodwin, inquire into this Julian Creel." I nodded. "But Mr. Wolfe," she said quickly, "I don't want the police involved. The museum mustn't know I was connected to this." "Then, madam," Wolfe said, "you are placing me in a moral labyrinth. Why should I trouble myself with it?" She looked directly at him. Because whoever left that note knows you and wanted you involved, and because they might come back. For a second, the only sound in the room was the faint buzz from the orchids upstairs. Wolfe studied her, his expression unreadable. "Archie," he said finally, "see that she leaves the lantern in my safe. Then bring me beer." That was that, which meant, naturally, it was not that at all. When she'd gone, I said, "You're taking this one?" He leaned back, closed his eyes, and said, "Someone has chosen to trespass upon my privacy with intent that cannot stand. Bring the Gazette file on Creel." So much for a quiet morning. Fritz brought the beer, and I brought the Gazette file, which was thin enough to make me think either Julian Creel had kept his nose clean or he'd washed it often. Wolfe flipped the folder with 2 fingers and let it lie. He prefers facts decanted by a human mouth to those printed on pulp. I phoned Lon Cohen at the Gazette and told him I wanted a quick rinse on Creel. Lon gave me the sound a newsroom makes when it's pretending to be calm and said, "Private collector, money from textiles. Likes Greek bronzes, dislikes provenance questions. There was chatter last spring. He was seen bidding in absentia through a London intermediary on a lantern from the Barstow estate. Didn't land it. Barstow died a month later. The estate closed ranks. Name of the intermediary? Nicolo Vassos. Lives between Midtown and an airplane. Slick hair, slicker hands." Lon paused. "Why?" "Because Mr. Wolfe is about to develop a distaste for slickness." I hung up before. He could get proprietary. Wolfe's eyes had closed while I relayed it. He does that to keep you from seeing that he's listening harder than you are. "Barstow," he said without opening them. "The reclusive bibliomaniac who dabbled in artifacts. And who, according to the probate gossip, left a collection that could outfit a small tyrant. Pfui. Tyrants prefer marble. What else? Creel has money, appetite, and a friend named Vassos, who supplies both and receipts for neither. Eleanor Fane is engaged to Creel and curates for a museum that would scream if it knew she's storing an antique in our safe like a spare umbrella." He opened his eyes. "The lantern is damaged. That is a message. Theodore." He raised his voice. "Theodore." You can always tell how worried Wolfe is by how many walls he intends his voice to travel through. Theodore came down from the plant rooms, smelling faintly of moss and rebuke. Wolfe pointed to the safe, and I delivered the bronze. Theodore took one look, settled at my desk without asking, and fished out a magnifier. He isn't an antiquarian, but he knows metal the way Fritz knows flame. "Recent bend," Theodore said after a minute. "Crimped from outside. The patina is broken along the filigree. See? The fracture edge is bright." He glanced at me. Whoever did this didn't worry about conservation. They worried about punctuation, I said. We didn't get to write a treatise, because the front doorbell rang the way a man rings it when he thinks doors should open themselves. Fritz sent me a look through the crack that said his kitchen was under assault, and I went. The man on the stoop could have been in an ad for expensive overcoats, thin, late 30s, good cheekbones you could shave with, and eyes with the color and warmth of coins. He had another man behind him, shorter, with a leather portfolio under his arm and a mouth that looked stapled. "Julian Creel," the overcoat said. "I'm here to see Mr. Wolfe." "Congratulations," I told him. "You found the right address." I let them into the hall and took a microsecond longer than necessary to hang their coats. The inner pockets yielded nothing but crisp air. The lawyer, I would have staked a bottle of scotch that the portfolio carried an injunction already typed, eyed the office door as though it might sting. Wolfe didn't get up. He honored the pair with 1 inch of chin movement. "Mr. Creel?" Creel came 2 steps into the room and stopped as men do when they hit the pressure of Wolfe's disinterest. "I won't pretend ignorance. Miss Fane came to you. She is nervous, and when Miss Fane is nervous, she becomes reckless." "You must learn to make distinctions," Wolfe said mildly. "Miss Fane is agitated, not reckless. You are her fiancé? I am. He didn't sit until I made a production of moving a chair into the only place a man with pride can take without looking, like he's obeying orders. The lawyer chose the edge and sat as if it might crumble his career. Creel cleared his throat. A bronze lantern was left at Miss Fane's door, from the Barstow collection. It belongs with the Barstow heirs. I intend to see it returned at once. I was told. He flicked me a glance, a test I didn't bother to pass. That you had involved yourself. I'm never involved, Wolfe said. I'm employed. Sometimes the distinction eludes people. Creel's coin eyes didn't flicker, but a muscle along his jaw wrote a sentence. If Miss Fane has engaged you, she did so without my knowledge. That is regrettable. Nevertheless, I am prepared to pay you to deliver the lantern to me for return to the heirs. Prepared how much? I asked. Good form requires the vulgarity to come from me. He named a figure that would pay the taxes on the roof and leave change for beer. The lawyer's mouth nearly smiled, which for that mouth was an indecent proposal. Wolfe let the number drift past him. Mr. Creel, he said, your offer presumes possession, which presumes knowledge, which presumes candor on your part. If you intend to return the object to the heirs, you could do that by contacting their counsel. Why interpose yourself? Because the intermediary is a parasite, Creel said crisply, and the heirs are cousins with an allergy to any object more complicated than a decanter. I will ensure the proper restitution and a quiet conclusion. Quiet, Wolfe repeated. An attractive word. He shifted his gaze to the lawyer. Your name? Loring, the man said. The voice had filing cabinet edges. Mr. Loring, Wolfe said, tell your client that Miss Fane is not here a supplicant. She is a principal. It is she who will determine the disposition of whatever property she has presented me with. Creel turned his head a fraction. It was the first time he looked directly at Wolfe. She has no authority. She's entangled because she is soft-hearted. A prankster dumped a broken trinket at her door to spoil her career and mine. I asked her not to embroil outsiders. Ah, Wolfe murmured. So you asked her. You knew then that she came. That landed. If Creel had hoped to look omniscient, he had sacrificed the how for the what. He adjusted the crease of his trousers, a neat gesture for regaining inchage. I knew when she failed to meet me at 11, and a doorman told me she took a cab uptown. There aren't many destinations in this neighborhood for a woman with her trouble. He rose. You'll let me know by evening. I prefer it handled discreetly. Miss Fane has nerves. The museum has donors. I have a schedule. He put a rectangle on my desk with 2 fingers. The card smelled faintly of camphor. 4 o'clock. They left with the kind of silence that notifies furniture it has survived. I shut the door and returned to Wolfe, who was watching, the card as if it might breed. Camphor, he said. Not his cologne. Protecting something from moths? Or masking something? He motioned at the safe. Return the lantern to its shelf. I did, and while I spun the dial, Wolfe said, Call Miss Fane. Inform her we require her presence at 6. Then, Mr. Goodwin, you will pay a call on Mr. Vassos. If he is nowhere, you will find him somewhere. Learn whether he handled anything from the Barstow estate that fits a lantern, or a box it could fit in. And Creel? Telephonically at 3:59, Wolfe said. When men who like control set deadlines, it is salutary to answer a minute before. It unsettles their clocks. Fritz appeared to announce lunch, and then to announce that lunch had suffered an indignity called delay. Wolfe told him 20 minutes, which is the one promise he keeps only when fate cooperates. I pocketed Creel's camphor card in my hat. Outside, the sky had that New York gray that makes bronze look warmer than people. I headed for Midtown, thinking about lanterns that arrive broken, men who arrive scented, and a note writer who knew Wolfe's name. Finding Nicolo Vassos was like hunting a rumor that owned cufflinks. Lon had said he lived between Midtown and an airplane, which meant his mailing address was a carry-on bag. Still, The man had to land somewhere, and that somewhere turned out to be the Ambassador Building on 49th. A sleek slab of glass that reflected more money than it contained. The lobby had a fountain that tried to sound tranquil over the buzz of phones, and a receptionist who thought my name should be on a list. "Mr. Vassos doesn't receive without appointment," she told me, not quite looking up from her manicure. "Then this isn't a reception," I said, and flashed a card that read Nero Wolfe, Confidential Investigations. I've found that the average desk sergeant, secretary, or security guard assumes a man carrying a card like that either knows the law or ignores it in expensive ways. She buzzed me through without enthusiasm. Vassos's suite was decorated by someone with a grudge against color. Gray carpet, silver desk, black and white prints of places he'd probably never been. He was on the phone when I entered, which gave me a chance to study him. The suit was perfect, the hair sculpted, and the expression that of a man who thought mirrors existed solely for reassurance. He clicked the receiver down and smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. "You must be the American." "That's me. Born under the sign of the dollar, Archie Goodwin. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Nero Wolfe." At the name, something moved behind his eyes, a quick calculation like a banker checking interest. "Wolfe," he said softly. "I've heard of him. He cultivates orchids, yes? He also cultivates truth, which is more expensive." He gestured toward a chair. "Then let's keep the rate reasonable. How may I assist?" I took a seat and crossed my legs. "You handled the Barstow estate auction last spring. There was a bronze lantern among the items." His smile didn't move. "Handled, no. Facilitated, perhaps. Many pieces change hands through discreet intermediaries. The lantern you mention, a charming object. There was fierce competition. A Mr. Creel, I believe, bid heavily and lost." "Creel's name has come up," I said. "He still seems interested. He dropped by Mr. Wolfe's this morning asking for the same lantern, broken and all." Now I had his full attention. The fingertips came together. "Broken? That would be a pity. Such artifacts survive centuries only to be destroyed by impatience." "Or intent," I said. It turned up on a doorstep, smashed in one corner. No note but a suggestion. "You'll need Wolfe. You wouldn't happen to know who likes to issue invitations that way?" He shook his head slowly. "My business requires silence, not graffiti. If someone used your employer's name, it was to add weight to their prank." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, does Mr. Wolfe intend to sell the piece?" That word "sell" came out too easily, like a reflex. "He intends to find out who's playing games with it. I'm guessing you've had dealings with both Creel and Miss Eleanor Fane." His tone thinned. "Creel, yes. A man who confuses acquisition with admiration. Miss Fane, never directly. Her museum declined our offers years ago. Too poor in coin, too rich in conscience. Yet somehow her doorstep became a delivery address." He looked at me the way a cat looks at an unopened can. "Are you suggesting I courier relics through the mail, Mr. Goodwin?" "I'm suggesting someone wanted that lantern in her possession, and maybe wanted her blamed for it." "Then your someone is cruel or clever or both," he murmured, "and possibly closer to her than to me." That closed one door, or pretended to. I thanked him, left a card I knew he'd throw away, and walked out past the receptionist, who had decided I wasn't the kind of visitor that tipped. Back on the street, the sky had turned a dim pewter. I called Wolfe from a payphone on 6th. He picked up after the second ring, which meant he was expecting me. "Well?" he said. "Vassos claims innocence. Smooth, slick, maybe rehearsed. He knew about the lantern, calls it charming, blames no one, but he perked up when I mentioned it was broken. He also called Creel greedy and Miss Fane virtuous. 2 compliments with hidden nails." "Describe his office." "Cold, colorless, expensive. No papers, no dust, no soul." "A man who curates appearance," Wolfe said. which is worse than curating artifacts. Return. I was halfway through the cab ride uptown when I noticed the smell. Camphor, faint, familiar, like the residue of Creel's card. It clung to my sleeve and I realized it hadn't come from Wolfe's office. Someone had brushed close enough to plant it. When I reached the brownstone, Wolfe had already closed his eyes for his afternoon session of introspection, which means thinking disguised as idleness. I told him about the camphor trace. His nostrils flared once, then settled. "It will recur," he said. "You will note where and when. And Miss Fane, she's due at 6. Good. Until then, keep the lantern untouched." I was heading for my desk when the doorbell rang again. I opened it expecting Fritz's grocery delivery or another protest from Creel. Instead, a boy in uniform held out an envelope. "For Mr. Wolfe," he said. "No sender." The handwriting was neat, deliberate, European. Wolfe sliced it open with a paper knife. Inside was a single photograph, the same bronze lantern, unbroken, glowing faintly from an unseen light source. Beneath it, a typed line. "The flame was never yours to guard." Fritz, Theodore, and I watched as Wolfe examined the photo. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. "Archie," he said, "bring Miss Fane the moment she arrives, and fetch a small magnifier. There is ink residue on the lower margin. Whoever wrote this may have used an old ribbon, which is talkative to the trained eye." He placed the photograph on a blotter, turned slightly toward me, and said, "Someone is cultivating symbolism. Lanterns, flames, theft, and guilt. All tiresome, but it suggests the thief's purpose is not profit." "Then what?" I asked. He sipped his beer. "Possession, not of the object but of consequence. Someone wishes to direct the narrative, to decide who is innocent and who is shamed. That, Mr. Goodwin, is a game I will not permit in my house." At 6 sharp, the doorbell sounded again. Fritz announced Miss Fane, pale but composed, carrying her handbag as though it might contain a confession. Wolfe didn't rise. He gestured her to a chair, pointed at the photograph, and said in a tone soft enough to cut glass, "Madam, kindly tell us who among your acquaintances would speak of flames that are not theirs." Her lips parted, and for the first time, I saw fear that wasn't for her job. It was personal, sharp, and recent. She looked at the photo, then at me, then back to Wolfe. "Only one person," she said quietly. "But he's been dead for 2 years." And Eleanor's door, that one sentence hung in the air like the aftertaste of a bad verdict. Wolfe's brows crept upward a 1/4 inch, which for him was the equivalent of a scream. I leaned forward because there are few phrases that reset an investigation faster than "he's been dead for 2 years." "Name?" Wolfe asked, as though she'd merely mentioned an inconvenient relative. "Professor Alaric Mendel," she said. "He was my mentor at the museum. He specialized in early Hellenic artifacts, bronzes, lamps, votive objects. He died suddenly. Stroke." She paused, the word sticking. "But he used to say that, about the flame. The flame is never yours to guard. It was his way of reminding students that we're custodians, not owners." Wolfe shifted slightly in his chair. "Your mentor's philosophy was admirable. Its resurrection, less so. Who else would know he used that expression?" "Many," she said. "He gave lectures, wrote papers. But only a few of us were close to him." "Enumerate," Wolfe said. Her fingers tightened on her handbag. "Julian Creel, for one. He funded some of Mendel's expeditions. And Niccolo Vassos. He supplied pieces for study, though the museum discouraged that connection. Then there was me and Dr. Russell Timmins, another curator. We worked together on the Harmodius lantern 2 years ago when it was in private hands, before Barstow acquired it." That was the first time she'd said "before Barstow." It caught my ear like a dissonant note. "So," I said, The lanterns had more addresses than a traveling salesman. Whose was it before Barstow's? Mendel's, she said quietly. It was part of his personal collection until shortly before he died. Then it was sold to Barstow by an intermediary. Vassos, I believe. Meaning, I said, that lantern has done the rounds. From mentor to collector to fiancé, and now to your doorstep. Her eyes dropped. Yes. Wolfe steepled his fingers. A pilgrimage of possession. Mr. Goodwin, you will observe that theft and inheritance often differ only in paperwork. He turned back to her. Did Professor Mendel's death coincide with the sale? She hesitated. Almost exactly. The sale was finalized a week after he died. Wolfe's eyes closed. Convenient. I whistled low. And now, 2 years later, his favorite metaphor shows up in typewritten poetry. You think someone's staging a resurrection? Someone, Wolfe said, is manufacturing guilt. The photograph's message appeals to Miss Fane's conscience. Someone who knew her connection to Mendel and who wished to unsettle her. The object chosen is emblematic, the damage deliberate. Fritz appeared with coffee, which meant it was officially evening. Wolfe took a cup, sniffed it approvingly, and said, Archie, retrieve the museum's annual reports for the past 3 years, particularly those naming Creel, Timmins, or Mendel. I would also like Creel's telephone number. We shall oblige him with punctual discourtesy. At precisely 3:59, as promised, Wolfe dialed Creel. I stood by with a notebook, though what Wolfe needed written down usually wasn't printable. Mr. Creel, he began, this is Nero Wolfe. I am telephoning as you suggested, though I doubt you anticipated enjoyment. The lantern remains under my care. Your eagerness to repossess it is unbecoming. It suggests anxiety. Anxiety in turn suggests complicity. Do you follow me? I heard a voice at the other end, taut and rapid. Wolfe's tone did not alter. Indeed, Miss Fane is here. She has been shown a photograph and has named you among those acquainted with Professor Mendel's peculiar aphorisms. Do not protest. Your intimacy with the man is already established. What concerns me is motive. The lantern's reappearance, the note, and the symbolic rhetoric all seem calculated to evoke Miss Fane's unease. That benefits you, perhaps, if she is too distressed to speak publicly about her past associations. I require an explanation by 9 this evening. You may send it by telephone or in person. If you fail to comply, I shall consider my silence unearned. He hung up with the same care one uses to extinguish a candle. That, I said, will make him squirm. That, Wolfe replied, will make him choose. To respond or to act? Miss Fane looked bewildered. You think Julian, I think nothing, Wolfe said. Thinking is premature. We must first compel revelation. Mr. Goodwin, you will pay another visit to Dr. Timmins. Learn how well the late Professor Mendel is remembered, and by whom. I would also like to know if any of his possessions, aside from the lantern, found peculiar paths after his death. I escorted Miss Fane to the door. She was paler than when she'd come, and her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her gloves. Archie, she said softly, I didn't tell Mr. Wolfe everything. Mendel's death, it wasn't only sudden. It was quiet. Too quiet. No autopsy, no questions. Julian arranged the funeral. He said the professor had been ill for months, but I never saw any sign. Why keep that to yourself? I asked. Because I didn't think it mattered, she said. Until now. She left with that hanging between us, and I watched her cab until it turned the corner. Then I phoned the museum and asked for Dr. Russell Timmins. A nasal secretary told me he was in residence for the night program, which translated to, he's working late, but doesn't want company. I convinced her that the company was coming anyway. The Metropolitan's back corridors were as empty as virtue after hours. I found Timmins in a storage room lit by a single overhead bulb, cataloguing ceramics with the energy of a man punishing himself. He was thin, meticulous, and wore gloves like a surgeon. "Dr. Timmins," I said. "Archie Goodwin, assistant to Nero Wolfe. I'm asking about Alaric Mendel." His reaction wasn't shock. It was irritation. Why drag up Mendel now? Because his ghost just mailed a photograph. That earned me a glare. Nonsense. Maybe. But his old lantern's been busy, sold, stolen, broken, and delivered. You worked on it, didn't you? He straightened. Under protest. Mendel was obsessed with that piece. Said it symbolized the continuity of enlightenment. When Barstow bought it, I told him it should stay in institutional hands. But Mendel changed. In his last months, he needed money. Or thought he did. For what? He hesitated, then shook his head. He mentioned a debt. Said it was owed to a friend who had made mistakes for him. He wouldn't say who. A week later, he collapsed in his study. And Creel arranged the funeral. Timmons's lips tightened. Creel arranged everything, including the sale of Mendel's private collection. The museum wasn't even notified until the items were already abroad. I called it theft. Creel called it liquidation. Sounds like he was liquidating a conscience, I said. Timmons snapped off the lamp. You can tell your Mr. Wolfe that Mendel was a proud man. If he thought a friend betrayed him, he'd find a way to keep that friend in the dark forever. Maybe he just did, I said, and left him to his ghosts. Back at the brown stone, Wolfe was waiting. He listened to my report without interruption, except a grunt when I reached the part about the debt. Money owed to a friend, he murmured. That explains both the sale and the silence. If Creel facilitated the transaction and profited, then his anxiety tonight is understandable. Maybe the friend wasn't Creel, I said. Maybe it was Vassos. Perhaps, Wolfe said. But Mendel's words, "The flame was never yours to guard," suggest accusation, not remorse. Someone is being reminded of theft, not loyalty. The question is, who authored the reminder? He looked up at the clock. It was 8:45. Prepare for visitors, Archie? I suspect Mr. Creel's conscience will arrive before his courage does. And when the doorbell rang at 8:59, Wolfe didn't even flinch. The bell sounded sharp enough to slice through the brownstone's usual calm. Fritz answered it, and a few seconds later, Julian Creel came in like a man who'd been pacing outside rehearsing lines he wasn't sure he'd deliver. His immaculate overcoat was buttoned wrong, which told me more than the expression he tried to wear. I relieved him of the coat before it could collapse from dignity and pointed him toward the red leather chair across from Wolfe. He sat, didn't speak, and when he finally looked up, it was straight at me, as if I were the one he needed to convince first. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, "I'm here because I don't appreciate being accused of whatever you implied over the phone. You have something that belongs to others, and I want it resolved before it ruins reputations." Wolfe didn't so much as twitch a finger. "Your concern for reputation is touching, Mr. Creel. Does it extend to the deceased Professor Mendel?" Creel's eyes narrowed. "Mendel? What has that got to do with this?" "Everything," Wolfe said. "The lantern once belonged to him. Miss Fane tells us you financed his later work, arranged the sale of his collection, and, coincidentally, his funeral. His philosophy, his property, and his pupil have now converged under my roof. I doubt the gods of coincidence are so industrious." Creel shifted in his seat. "You're implying something sordid, and I won't have it. Mendel was ill. Confused, he asked me to dispose of his things to settle certain obligations. I did so legally." "Did he write that instruction?" Wolfe asked. "No, he dictated it to his secretary. She witnessed it. And where is this witness now?" "In Greece," he snapped. "Teaching." "Ah, geography, the last refuge of unverifiable truth." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, as if bored. You were aware, then, that the lantern reappeared this week at Miss Fane's door? Creel hesitated. She told me. And did she tell you it was broken? Yes. Did she tell you about the note? He frowned. Note? The photograph, I said. And the message typed on it. The flame was never yours to guard. Ring a bell. His face changed then, subtly, but enough for Wolfe to notice. That's absurd. Mendel used to spout that line constantly. It was his favorite bit of pompous drivel. Anyone could have known it. Not quite anyone, Wolfe said softly. It was never published. Miss Fane informed us the phrase was confined to his lectures and personal correspondence. Are you quite sure you didn't use it yourself recently? Of course not. Creel's voice had a tremor now, small but audible. You're trying to bait me. Yes, Wolfe said evenly. Successfully, it seems. You may as well finish the thought you are so desperately suppressing. Creel's mouth tightened, then loosened again. He glanced toward the safe as though he could sense the lantern behind its steel door. That thing, he said, was a mistake from the beginning. Mendel bought it illegally, smuggled from a dig site through Vassos. I covered for him because he begged me to. When Barstow bought it, I took a commission for arranging the sale, yes. But I did it to recover funds, not to profit from his death. You can check the records. I let out a low whistle. So the late professor wasn't quite the saint his protégés make him. He was brilliant, Creel said, the words half a plea. And careless, the kind of man who'd ruin himself out of idealism. He owed Vassos money, not me. I was the middleman, nothing more. Wolfe opened his eyes. Middlemen are the only men who ever touch everything and own nothing. Convenient. He leaned back slightly. Your anxiety is understandable now. A smuggled artifact, a forged sale, and a dead man's signature, any of which, if uncovered, would tarnish your spotless veneer. Tell me, did you keep copies of the documents you arranged? Creel's silence was answer enough. You see, Wolfe said, someone wants this entire episode to resurface. The note to Miss Fane, the photograph, the damage. To the lantern, all are prods toward confession, but not to hers. He let that hang. Creel's fingers twitched once, then went still. You think someone's targeting me? I know someone is, Wolfe replied. The question is whether the tormentor is motivated by conscience or calculation. Creel stood abruptly. You'll have your explanation tomorrow. I'll bring proof of everything, correspondence, invoices, the customs records. Then you can see how foolish this all is. As you wish, Wolfe said. Tomorrow at 11. When the door shut behind him, I turned to Wolfe. He's lying, of course. Of course, Wolfe said. He will not return with proof. He will attempt to erase it. Meaning he'll go after whoever still has it. Vassos? Precisely. And Vassos will not enjoy the attention. That prediction got its confirmation sooner than either of us expected. At 9:30, I was in the front room flipping through the day's notes when the phone rang. I caught it on the second ring. A male voice, breathless, said, Tell Wolfe. Tell him. Creel was here. He knows he... There was a sharp clatter, then silence. Vassos, I said. Nothing. The line had gone dead. Wolfe looked up sharply when I repeated it. Address, he said. Ambassador Building, 49th. He nodded once. Take Saul Panzer. Go. Observe. Do not intervene. If police are present, listen. If not, listen harder. Saul and I reached the ambassador in under 15 minutes. The lobby that had been sleek earlier now buzzed with uniformed activity. A patrolman barred us halfway to the elevator. Police business, he barked. Private business that just turned public, I said. What's the trouble? Trouble's upstairs. Suite 904. A man dead. Stabbed. Nicolo Vassos. I thanked him and stepped back before curiosity became obstruction. Saul gave me a look that said he was already memorizing faces and license plates. "Creel's not stupid enough to do it himself," I said under my breath. "No," Saul replied, "but he might be desperate enough to have it done." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report without interruption. His only comment came at the end, delivered in a tone that made the air seem colder. "So the circle tightens," he said. "A dead intermediary, a frightened collector, and a frightened woman. That leaves only the unseen hand that arranges the pattern and the reason for its arrangement." He poured himself a second beer, set it aside untouched, and added, "Tomorrow morning, Mr. Goodwin, I shall summon all of them, the living at least. We will see who brings the darkness into my house and whether they can bear the light." He leaned back, half closing his eyes. "And Archie, see that the lantern is placed on my desk before they arrive. It will illuminate more than the room." Morning in the brownstone always comes in layers. Fritz's quiet orchestra of pans from the kitchen, the faint hiss from the greenhouse upstairs, and Wolfe's voice dictating breakfast decisions like a Roman emperor planning a campaign. I'd barely finished my eggs when he called me into the office. The safe was open, and the bronze lantern sat on his desk where the morning light could pick out every dent and shadow. He didn't look up as I entered. "Mr. Panzer telephoned at 8. The police have identified no weapon, no witnesses, and no clear motive. They will, of course, pursue the obvious. Robbery gone awry." "Phooey." "Creel?" I asked. "Absent. The doorman confirms he arrived at Vassos' office last night around 9. He departed 15 minutes later. Vassos was alive then. Our Mr. Creel will say as much and produce a witness or two willing to corroborate it, for a fee." I leaned against the desk. That still leaves a dead fence, a missing set of documents, and a lantern that keeps changing hands like a cursed potato. "What's our move?" He looked up at me, his eyes small but bright. "We do not move, Archie. We invite motion. Assemble them all here at noon. Miss Fane, Mr. Creel, and Dr. Timmins. Inform each that I have solved the matter of the lantern and will disclose the truth in private session. Use that phrase precisely. It will guarantee attendance. Even Creel. After last night, I think he'd be halfway to Montreal. If he flees, that too is illumination." He lifted the photograph again, the one showing the unbroken lantern. "This picture was not taken by an amateur. The lighting is professional. Note the faint halo around the base. It was photographed under controlled conditions. I am persuaded that it was taken before the artifact was damaged. Someone had access to it while it was intact, meaning before it landed on Miss Fane's doorstep." "Exactly." He paused, regarding the artifact as though it might confess if stared at long enough. "Bring Miss Fane first." "Alone." She arrived shortly after 11, pale but determined, the kind of woman who had decided that fear was unseemly but hadn't found a better substitute. Wolfe motioned her to sit. "Miss Fane," he began, "Vassos is dead. He was stabbed last night after speaking with Mr. Creel. The police will undoubtedly question you soon. Before they do, I require full disclosure regarding your relationship with both men." Her hands knotted in her lap. "I already told you, Julian was my fiancé. Vassos I barely knew. He used to come to the museum with pieces for appraisal. Always charming, always just within the law." "And Professor Mendel?" Wolfe asked. She swallowed. "He was more than a mentor. I admired him. Too much, perhaps. Julian thought the same. They quarreled once about the lantern. Julian said it was worthless. Mendel said it was sacred. After that, Julian refused to fund his work." Wolfe's voice softened. "And the phrase, 'the flame was never yours to guard.' When did you last hear it?" "The day before he died," she whispered. "He said it to me when I tried to convince him to sell some of his pieces to pay off his debts. He refused. He said some things shouldn't belong to anyone. I never forgot it." Wolfe's lids drooped. "Nor, it seems, did someone else." The bell rang. Fritz ushered in Creel, followed by Timmins, who looked as if he'd been dragged from a hangover of conscience rather than liquor. Creel's composure was patched together with caffeine and arrogance. Wolfe greeted them with a perfunctory nod. "Gentlemen, Miss Fane, you are here because I intend to resolve the matter of the lantern and the recent death that accompanies it. First, observe." He pointed to the artifact. The dented bronze caught the sunlight in a dull gleam. This, you claim, is the lantern of Harmodius. In truth, it is not. The authentic lantern was destroyed years ago during a private excavation on Thassos. This is a replica, one of several produced later by a workshop Mendel patronized. Creel snorted. "Ridiculous." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "meticulous. The pattern of the filigree, the asymmetry of the handle, the alloy composition, all match a Thasian reproduction. Mendel purchased one for study. But when Barstow's auction was arranged, the genuine article was listed in its place. The false one sold to Barstow, the real one disappeared. When Barstow died, both lanterns resurfaced in private circulation. Mr. Creel, you had opportunity to replace one with the other." Creel rose halfway from his chair. "That's absurd. You think I'd risk forgery?" "I think you did risk exposure," Wolfe said calmly. "When Mendel died, the authentic lantern was in his study. You sold the replica to Barstow and pocketed the difference, confident that no one would notice. Mendel's death removed the only witness who could. When Miss Fane recognized inconsistencies in the museum's catalogue, you courted her to control the risk. But Vassos learned of your substitution and began to extort you. You promised him a share of your proceeds until he demanded more." Creel's face had gone bloodless. "You're inventing fiction." "Not fiction," Wolfe said. "Continuation. The photograph sent to Miss Fane shows the real lantern, unbroken. Vassos took it before attempting to negotiate. You, Mr. Creel, sought to recover it. You found him uncooperative. You left his office at 9:15. He was dead by 9:30. Timmins shifted uneasily. "But if that's true, where's the genuine piece?" Wolfe looked to Miss Fane. "Ask her." She stared at him, horrified. "I don't have it." "No," Wolfe agreed, "but you had it. Mendel left it to you, did he not? Hidden among his effects. Unlabeled. Unregistered. You discovered it after his death and, unsure what it was, kept it. When someone, perhaps Mr. Creel, learned of your possession, they replaced it with the replica and returned that to you in broken form, hoping the deceit would go unnoticed." She looked stricken. "You think Julian?" "I think Julian panicked," Wolfe said. "He could not afford for anyone to compare the two lanterns. The substitution was careless, but the intent was not theft. It was erasure. Vassos's murder, however, was not his hand. Someone else intervened." "Who?" I asked. "Timmins," Wolfe said quietly. Timmins flinched. "That's insane." "Is it?" Wolfe asked. "You knew of Mendel's debt, his shame, and Creel's manipulation. You resented all of them for exploiting what you saw as your mentor's legacy. When you learned Vassos possessed the real lantern, you went to retrieve it. But he was already bargaining with Creel. In the argument that followed, you killed him. Not for profit, for preservation. You intended to restore the relic to its rightful place, free from their corruption. You typed the note and sent the photograph to Miss Fane to ensure the secret reached her. Only you would have remembered Mendel's words and had access to the photograph archives. The silence that followed was brittle. Timmins' mouth opened and closed, searching for air that wouldn't incriminate him. He betrayed everything Mendel believed in," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "They all did. I just wanted to end it." Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "A noble motive rendered ignoble by execution. You may tell the police what you wish. Mr. Goodwin will see that you find them safely." As I escorted Timmins out, he didn't resist, just stared ahead, murmuring something about fire and truth. When I came back, Miss Fane was still seated, staring at the lantern, and Creel was gone. Wolfe looked at her over the rim of his beer. "You are relieved of guilt, madam, but not responsibility. You will return that artifact to your museum under proper documentation. Perhaps then its flame may finally rest." She nodded slowly, thanked him, and left. When the door closed, Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and said, "The irony, Archie, is eternal. Men kill not for what light reveals, but for what it conceals." I said, "And what it's worth on the black market." He didn't open his eyes. "Pfui, bring me the Gazette, and tell Fritz we'll have roast duck tonight. I find the moral appetite reawakening." It was nearly 3 by the time Inspector Kramer came, wearing the look of a man who'd had too little coffee and too many reports. He brought with him that kind of atmosphere that wrinkles Fritz's napkins and makes Wolfe's blood pressure perform acrobatics. He didn't wait to be invited to sit. He took the red chair, dropped his hat on the corner of my desk, and fixed Wolfe with the expression he usually reserves for suspicious corpses. "All right," Kramer said. "Timmins just turned himself in at the precinct, confessing to stabbing Vassos. He mentioned you, the lantern, and something about ancient Greek curses. What kind of circus are you running here?" "A civilized one," Wolfe said dryly. "If Mr. Timmins has confessed, my function is complete." "Your function," Kramer grunted, "is to stay out of homicides. You could have called me before sending your man to fetch a confession." "I did not send Mr. Goodwin to fetch anything," Wolfe replied. "I sent him to escort Mr. Timmins safely. It seems I overestimated the efficiency of your department." That got the usual puff of cigar smoke and a glare that could have scalded an egg. You always have to get the last word, don't you? "I prefer the correct word," Wolfe said, regardless of position. Kramer turned to me. "You were there, Goodwin. Was Timmins making sense, or has the whole museum gone nuts?" He made sense, if you accept that his sense of justice was about 3 centuries behind the times. He thought killing a fence was equivalent to returning cultural property. Kramer snorted. "He's going to find that theory doesn't impress juries. You sure Creel wasn't in on it?" "Creel was too busy saving his reputation," I said. "Timmins didn't act for him, though the idea might have occurred to him later." Kramer grunted again, rose, and jabbed his cigar toward Wolfe. "You and I will talk again when the DA starts asking who knew what and when. And don't think your fancy phrasing keeps you out of my reports." "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "I expect to be in them. Accurately." Kramer left in a cloud of disapproval. When the door closed, the brownstone exhaled. Fritz, hearing the coast was clear, came in with coffee in the latest edition of the Gazette. Wolfe took the cup, set it down untasted, and looked at me. "Archie," he said, "Mr. Timmins is a convenient culprit." Too convenient. That perked my ears. "You think he didn't do it?" "He did something, certainly," Wolfe said, his fingers drumming once against the arm of his chair. "But his motive is a construction. Logical enough to stand, weak enough to collapse at scrutiny. He is too self-conscious in guilt. A true penitent, perhaps, but not a murderer." I leaned back. If he's not the one who stuck the knife in Vassos, then who did? Wolfe's gaze drifted toward the safe. "The answer is in that bronze, if one can read the language properly." "The lantern," I said. "I thought that case was wrapped." "It is tied," Wolfe said, "but not sealed." He gestured for me to open the safe. I lifted the heavy replica out and set it on the desk. The dent gleamed under the lamp. Wolfe adjusted the light, then took a magnifying glass from the drawer and bent closer. "There," he murmured. "See the edge of the fracture? It was not merely bent. It was pried." I leaned in. "So someone opened it?" "Precisely. This lantern is not hollow for ornament. It contains a compartment. The damage was deliberate, to extract, not destroy." He tapped the table. And the true question, Archie, is what was taken. Documents? Perhaps. Mendel's personal correspondence, or evidence of the forgery Creel engineered. But whatever it was small, valuable, and damning enough to kill for. I thought of Vassos, sprawled in his grey office, and Creel's tight smile. Then whoever killed Vassos wasn't trying to avenge Mendel. They were trying to clean house. Wolfe nodded slightly. You are learning, Archie. Timmins may have discovered Vassos's extortion, but he lacked the cunning to stage this. Creel, however, possesses both motive and method. He visited Vassos last night. His hands are clean because he hired another's. Then we're back where we started, I said. A rich man with secrets, a dead man with evidence, and a lantern that's lost its light. Wolfe smiled faintly. Not quite lost. Return Miss Fane to us this evening at 7. There remains one more candle to extinguish. I did as instructed. By the time Eleanor arrived, Fritz had cleared dinner service, and the office was prepared for Wolfe's version of theatre. Lamps dimmed, chairs set with geometric precision, and the bronze lantern centered like a relic on trial. She entered quietly, eyes wary. Inspector Kramer told me Timmins confessed, she said. Isn't it over? Miss Fane, Wolfe said, confession is not synonymous with truth. Sit, please. She obeyed. Wolfe studied her face as one might a chessboard before the decisive move. You loved Professor Mendel, he said, not as a question. She flinched but didn't deny it. He was kind and brilliant, and he believed in me. That isn't a crime. Of course not, Wolfe said. But it is relevant. You kept his memory, his work, and perhaps more than you realized. After his death, you found papers among his effects. Letters, perhaps, implicating Creel in smuggling and forgery. She stared at him, eyes wide. How could you? Because Vassos learned of them, Wolfe said. He hinted as much before his death. Those documents were hidden inside this lantern, the one Creel replaced with the replica. Vassos pried it open to remove them. That was his final mistake. Her voice was barely audible. You mean Creel killed him? Not directly, Wolfe said. He paid a man to retrieve the documents, and that man silenced Vassos. When the papers proved dangerous, Creel destroyed them, except perhaps one. A letter. Mendel's last. She reached into her handbag with trembling fingers and drew out a folded sheet of age-stained paper. You mean this? She said. I couldn't help a low whistle. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed. You withheld it. I was afraid, she said. It arrived by post, yesterday morning. No return address. It's in Mendel's handwriting, dated the day before he died. I unfolded it carefully. The note was brief, the script firm despite the age. If they come for the lantern, let them. What it holds is mine only in memory. The flame belongs to no one. Wolfe read it once, slowly, then looked at her. That, madam, is not philosophy. It is farewell. Mendel knew what Creel had done and forgave him before death. A pity Creel could not return the courtesy. She pressed the paper to her chest. What will you do with it? Nothing, Wolfe said. It has served its purpose. Mr. Creel will be arrested in due course, his hired instrument already detained, no doubt, by Mr. Panzer's quiet diligence. The rest belongs to the law. She rose unsteadily. Then it's over? Yes, Wolfe said. And yet nothing ever is. People break as easily as bronze. Sometimes they are patched, sometimes they are buried. When she had gone, Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and reached for his beer. Archie, he said, kindly return the lantern to the safe. It has earned a rest, as have I. Sure, I said, but if I start dreaming about Greek ghosts, I'm charging overtime. He grunted, which in Wolfe's language meant both assent and dismissal. The lantern caught the last trace of lamplight as I locked it away, the dent glinting like a wink from a secret finally at peace. The next morning began in silence, the kind that usually means Wolfe is either satisfied or dangerous. I couldn't tell which until I came into the office and saw the Gazette folded neatly beside his untouched breakfast tray. The headline read, "Collector questioned in famed dealer's murder." There was a smaller line beneath it. Police investigate museum ties, smuggling allegations. Wolfe glanced up from his orchids when I entered. "You have read it?" "I have," I said, setting my coffee down. Kramer's boys seem to be doing the heavy lifting for once. Creel's being grilled, Timmins is remorseful, and Miss Fane's been cleared. I'd say your conscience can sleep tonight. "Fey," Wolfe said, turning back to his flowers. "My conscience is never awake. Only my digestion." That was his way of saying he wasn't finished thinking. He spent the next hour pretending to care about an ailing Miltonia, and I spent the next hour trying not to remind him that Fritz's breakfast soufflé was going cold. It wasn't until 11 that he rang the bell for beer, which meant the mental machinery had finally settled its gears. "Archie," he said after the first sip, "we have neglected something." "That's impossible," I said. "We have checked every angle except the metaphysical." He ignored me. "The lantern was pried open, yes, but we never verified what it contained before Vassos's death." Mendel's letter arrived separately, and Miss Fane swears she received no other documents, yet Vassos was killed because of something tangible. Ergo, something remains missing. Meaning Creel didn't destroy everything. "Meaning," Wolfe said, "Creel may not have known what he possessed." He glanced at the clock. "Kramer will call within the hour to announce Creel's confession or his lawyer's excuses. Before that, I wish to confirm a suspicion. Fetch the lantern." I opened the safe and brought it out. Wolfe examined it again, tilting it so the light caught the inner curve of the metal. He tapped one side gently with a pen, then frowned. "There. Hear it? All I hear is bronze. Listen again." He tapped once more, near the base. This time the sound was duller, not hollow. "A false bottom," he said. "The craftsman who created these replicas was resourceful." "Want me to pry it?" He grimaced. "With delicacy, please. I have no wish to add vandalism to our resume." I found a thin palette knife in the drawer, slid it under the dented edge, and gave it a careful twist. Something shifted with a small metallic sigh, and a narrow disc rolled out. A coin no larger than a silver dollar, green with age but still marked by faint Greek letters around its rim. "Well," I said, "either we've struck treasure or someone's ancient laundry token." Wolfe held out his hand. "Give it here." He examined it through the magnifier, eyes narrowing. "This is not currency. It is a seal, an insignia token used for authentication. See the crest? The Harmodius sigil. Mendel must have hidden it himself. He feared discovery. Discovery by who? By whoever financed the forgeries. Not Creel alone. Creel lacked imagination. He needed a partner with access to craftsmen and export routes. Vassos, naturally. But Vassos was an agent, not an originator. There was someone above them. "You mean the supplier?" "Precisely. Mendel likely suspected him. This seal would identify the workshop producing replicas. A single coin can trace an entire web of fraud. That is what Vassos retrieved, and why he died." Before I could respond, the phone rang. I picked it up. Kramer's voice came through sharp as gravel. "Goodwin, tell your boss Creel just had a heart attack during questioning. He's dead." I blinked. That's convenient timing. "For somebody," Kramer said. "Maybe for you two if you stay out of the way. I'll be by later." I hung up and turned to Wolfe. "Creel just cashed out. Massive coronary." He exhaled through his nose. "How untidy." The dead refused to answer questions. "On the bright side," I said, "that might close the book." "No," he said softly. "It opens another." He motioned toward the coin. This object was never meant to reach police hands, and yet Mendel ensured it would surface eventually. He sent his letter to Miss Fane as decoy, knowing the true evidence lay within the lantern. Creel's death removes the visible culprit, but not the architect. I sat down. Then who's left to profit from the whole mess? The forgeries are exposed, the museum scandal's public, and the merchandise is worthless now. Wolfe smiled faintly. Worthless only to the ignorant. To collectors of contraband, a proven forgery can be more valuable than the original. Rarity of scandal. Someone wanted that network intact. Someone with patience and reach. You think Vassos's boss decided to tie up loose ends? Indubitably. But he overreached. Wolfe reached for the phone. Mr. Panzer must locate the craftsman who fabricated the replicas. There will be invoices, correspondence, perhaps under an alias. A man clever enough to mint deceit will not resist the vanity of record. The next few hours were spent in the brownstone's version of waiting, Wolfe brooding, Fritz cooking, and me pretending to read while keeping an ear on the phone. Around 4, it rang again. Saul's voice came in low. Got your forger. Name's Nicola Petrescu. Romanian. Works out of Queens. Been quiet since yesterday. Too quiet. His workshop was torched this morning. Dead? Wolfe asked from his chair. Gone, Saul said. Neighbors saw a dark sedan around dawn. Same type registered to one Nicolo Vassos last year. When I hung up, Wolfe closed his eyes and said, So the circle burns itself. Convenient symmetry. That's it then, I asked. Creel dead, the forger missing, Vassos buried, Timmins in custody, and Miss Fane trying to rebuild her conscience. Who's left? Us, Wolfe said. And the truth, which is always the final guest. Evening came soft and slow. Wolfe finally emerged from his mental cellar and instructed Fritz to serve dinner in the office, a privilege usually reserved for crises or victories. When the roast duck arrived, the smell alone could have absolved anyone of sin. Wolfe carved methodically, poured 2 glasses of beer, and said, You may congratulate me, Archie. Justice has once again triumphed through the grace of logic. Sure, I said, but logic doesn't mop up corpses. That's Kramer's line of work. Justice, he said, rarely concerns itself with comfort. Men like Creel are merely embers. They burn and extinguish themselves. What remains is illumination. I raised my glass. To illumination. He nodded, solemn as a priest. To appetite, Archie. Morale and otherwise. One must feed both, or perish from starvation of the mind. After dinner, I locked the lantern in the safe one last time. Its dent caught the lamplight, the glimmer dulled now but not gone. Wolfe had already closed his eyes again, the faintest smile curling beneath the mustache, as if the whole business had been a long, intricate meal, now finally digested. I shut off the lights, leaving the office quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. The case had begun, with a trespass on Wolfe's sanctuary, and ended as they always did, with the house restored, the intruders gone, and the world outside once again unworthy of his notice. Somewhere in Queens, a man was still missing, a trail of forgeries smoldered, and an ancient lantern sat in our safe like the last echo of a truth too fragile to shine. But in that room, with the faint scent of beer and orchids mingling in the air, everything was at peace. Until the next knock on the door. The next knock didn't come that night, but the silence had an edge that promised it would. I woke the next morning with the sense something in the house had shifted. It wasn't Fritz. His movements stay as steady as a metronome. Nor Wolfe, who was in his plant rooms communing with orchids and obstinacy. It was subtler, like the brownstone had drawn a long breath and was waiting to see what followed. The phone rang at 9:30. It wasn't Kramer or Saul this time. It was Miss Fane. Her voice was tighter than the last time I'd heard it. "Archie," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "Something's happened at the museum. You and Mr. Wolfe need to come." I almost laughed. Wolfe, coming anywhere is like asking a mountain to stroll, but her tone stripped the humor right out of it. What is it? The lantern, she said. It's gone. That got my full attention. Gone where? You brought it to the museum? I did, yesterday afternoon after I left your house. I turned it over to the registrar for temporary safekeeping. When I arrived this morning, the cabinet was broken open. The guards saw nothing, and the cameras were off for maintenance. It's as if it vanished into air. I told her to sit tight and called Saul before Wolfe. Saul's line clicked after one ring. You heard? I asked. Yeah, he said. Kramer called me before dawn. He's livid. Says if your boss doesn't stop hoarding relics, he'll start charging him museum fees. I left him to his sarcasm and went upstairs. Wolfe was tending a Cattleya bloom with the reverence other men reserve for religion. I waited until he set down the mister before delivering the news. He didn't even blink. It was inevitable, he said. Thieves have appetites. The lantern was a lure, not a prize. Then someone took the bait, I said. He nodded once. You will go to the museum, speak with Miss Fane and the guards, observe before the police muddle the scene. I will remain here and contemplate the implications. Contemplate quietly, I hope, I said, but he was already drifting inward. The museum had its usual air of sanctified panic, whispered voices, shoes squeaking on marble, security men trying to look competent, while Kramer's presence made them wish they were invisible. He spotted me before I could dodge him. Well, he said, your friend's relic is turning out to be a traveling salesman. Any bright theories, Goodwin? Only that whoever took it knew exactly where to look and when to come, I said. Miss Fane? In her office, he said. And before you ask, yes, we've already checked her story. The cameras really were down. Maintenance logs confirm it. That didn't make me feel better. Eleanor Fane was standing by her desk, pale but steady, her coat still on as if she hadn't dared settle. They're saying it's an inside job, she said. Someone with a master key, but I swear, Archie, I didn't tell anyone where it was stored. Who knew? Only the registrar, the chief curator, and Dr. Timmons's assistant. The exhibit wing was locked after hours. The guard on duty claims no one entered. Show me the cabinet. She led me through the quiet hall to a side gallery, still half shadowed in morning light. The glass case stood open, one hinge bent, the label beside it blank. A thin layer of dust on the shelf had been disturbed by a single circular mark where the lantern had rested. Something else caught my eye, an oily residue near the hinge, faint but visible. I touched it with a handkerchief. Camphor, the same scent that had followed Creel. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in the office, surrounded by silence so complete it could have been part of the furnishings. I handed him the handkerchief. He sniffed it once and grunted. Predictable. Camphor again, I said. Same as Creel's calling card? Yes. His mark. And his mistake. The scent endures where men do not. Whoever removed the lantern used material he had handled recently, which means Creel's death did not end his usefulness. Then someone used his resources, his contacts, his property, Wolfe corrected, including his keys. The thief knew the museum's schedules and Miss Fane's actions. That knowledge did not originate yesterday. It was prepared. I frowned. By who? By the same party who orchestrated the original forgery. The workshop may have burned, but the mind behind it remains active. Mendel's seal, now recovered, was proof of an organized enterprise. When that seal resurfaced, panic followed. You think the lantern's been taken to destroy the last link? Possibly, he said. Or to sell it again, now that notoriety inflates its value. In either case, the thief must move it quickly before the museum's alerts spread. Therefore, they will seek a buyer who deals in discretion. Meaning? He looked at me. meaning, Mr. Goodwin, that you will find one. Begin with Vassos's associates, antiquities brokers, restorers, importers. Somewhere in that circle, the lantern will flicker once more. Saul and I spent the rest of the day tracing Vassos's old network. By evening, we'd found 2 names of interest, a restorer in Newark who'd suddenly closed shop, and a dealer on East 67th who'd started paying cash for untraceable bronzes. The dealer, one, Casimir Durrell, was the kind of man who made lies sound cultured. When I visited his shop, the place smelled of old varnish and money. Durrell met me with a smile that tried to charm and failed by being practiced. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "you've been expected." "By who?" He shrugged elegantly. "By the kind of people who know when others start asking questions." His hand drifted toward a side table. Sitting there, half covered by a cloth, was the lantern. The dent still glinted under the lamplight. "That piece," I said casually. "Antique, 5th century BC. Where'd you acquire it?" "A client who values privacy," he said. "And punctual payment. Surely you're not here on behalf of the museum." "Something like that," I said. "How much privacy does he value?" "Enough to reclaim it himself shortly." I nodded. "Then I'll wait with it." He smiled again. Smaller now. "I'm afraid that's not possible." The back door creaked then, and a shadow filled it. Tall, heavy, deliberate. The kind of man who could make a gun look like good manners. Durrell sighed, almost theatrically. "You see, Mr. Goodwin, my clients do not appreciate visitors." I moved before he finished the sentence. The lamp went over first, plunging us into half-darkness, and the sound of bronze hitting wood was followed by shouts and one very familiar curse. Saul Panzer's from the alley. Shots cracked once, twice, and then silence. When the police finished cataloging what was left of Durrell's operation, Kramer found me leaning against the stoop, breathing smoke and adrenaline. "Next time," he said, "try calling before you start a war in an antique shop." "I'll pencil that in," I told him. "But you might want to check the lantern before it changes address again." He grunted and waved his men forward. Behind them, Saul handed me a cigarette with a smirk. "Nice timing," I said. "Pure coincidence," he said. "Or Wolfe." By the time we got back, the brownstone lights were still on. Wolfe sat waiting, the beer already poured. I set the lantern on his desk. It looked older now, as if it had finally earned its legend. He examined it briefly, then leaned back. "So," he said, "the flame returns." "And burns everything in its path," I said. He nodded once, as all truth does. The case wasn't over. Wolfe never believes in endings. But the house felt steadier again. Outside, New York kept humming its endless tune, but inside, the air was calm, the order restored, and the last ember of the lantern's light found its quiet home. The final act began as they always do, with Wolfe refusing to admit the case was finished. It was 2 days after the museum had reclaimed the lantern and Kramer had filed his report. Durrell's buyer had disappeared into international mist, and the newspapers were already reducing the whole thing to a headline about antique smuggling, ring broken. But Wolfe was still brooding, which meant the story hadn't been tucked away in his head yet. He sat in his chair, eyes half closed, fingers steepled in that cathedral of thought he builds when something remains imperfect. Fritz had served a lamb roast, which went untouched, and even the beer stood neglected, a crime against civilization in Wolfe's opinion. I was flipping through the Gazette, trying to appear occupied. "The missing piece," he said finally, "was never the lantern." "Don't tell me," I said, setting down the paper. "It was me all along." "Phooey," he muttered. "It was Mendel. He anticipated everything, Creel's avarice, Vassos's deceit, even Miss Fane's conscience. That letter he wrote was not a farewell. It was a test. He wanted to see whether those who followed him would protect knowledge or consume it, and every one of them failed. I thought about that. Including us? He cracked one eye. We were merely custodians, Mr. Goodwin. We did not steal, kill, or covet. We maintained the order of things. That is the most any man can do. Sure, I said, but it feels like we've been babysitting a cursed candle. Not cursed, he said. Human. It illuminated folly, our most abundant resource. There was a knock on the door before I could answer. Fritz ushered in Miss Fane. She looked different this time, composed but lighter, as if she'd put down something heavy. I wanted to thank you, she said. The museum's trustees have cleared me. They've decided to place the lantern in storage until the investigation's end. I thought you'd like to know. Storage, Wolfe repeated with faint approval. Where all dangerous truths should rest. She smiled. They also asked if you would consider lecturing for our ethics committee. He made a sound that might have been laughter in a different climate. Madam, I do not lecture, I state. My statements are not designed to persuade, but to conclude. I'll tell them you declined with dignity, she said. He inclined his head. Do so. When she left, Wolfe stared at the closed door for a long moment. There, he said, goes a woman who will one day learn to live without guilt. A rare and valuable artifact. I said, and what about the one still sitting in our safe? The lantern. He waved a hand. An imitation. The museum recovered the wrong one. That made me sit up straight. You're kidding. Not at all. I replaced it before you left for the museum. The genuine lantern remains here. I whistled low. That's a felony with flair. You planning to keep it? Of course not, he said. I will return it quietly when men have stopped killing for it. Perhaps in 6 months. Perhaps never. I looked at him, at the calm mountain of him framed by his orchids and his quiet certainty. You realize that makes you the custodian Mendel hoped for. He closed his eyes. Nonsense. I'm merely a man protecting his house from intrusion. The world's idiocies find their way to my doorstep. I do what is necessary to restore equilibrium. Then equilibrium's looking good, I said. Kramer's satisfied, the museum's grateful, and the press thinks the case is closed. He gave a small nod. It is closed. For now. That was as close to peace as he ever got. Fritz came in with coffee and apple tart, and the office began to feel alive again, the safe hum of the brownstone returning, the rhythm restored. I stood by the window and looked out at the evening. The city glowed in its usual haze of ambition and deceit, every streetlight another little lantern burning for someone's truth or someone's lie. Behind me, Wolfe said, Archie. Yeah. You may record the matter as concluded under the title, The Lantern Heist. Add the notation, Human folly remains unsolved. I grinned. You want me to file it under mysteries or morals? Both, he said, and bring me the beer. The flame may belong to no one, but thirst is mine alone. I handed him the glass. He took it, lifted it slightly toward the safe, and drank. A quiet toast to reason, to appetite, and to the eternal, maddening glow of curiosity that kept men, and sometimes lanterns, burning. That was how it ended. The brownstone steady again, Wolfe content in his chair, the world outside as unfixable as ever. And me, closing the door on another story where light and shadow had traded places long enough to remind us both. Some truths aren't meant to be owned, only kept.